The morning started like any other at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Terminal C buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Business travelers clutching their coffee cups, families heading home after weekend trips, and airline staff going about their routine preparations. Flight AA 2317 to Chicago seemed perfectly ordinary as passengers settled into their seats. The familiar sounds of overhead bins clicking shut and safety announcements filled the cabin. A flight attendant helped an elderly couple with their bags while a young mom tried to keep her toddler entertained with coloring books. In row 23, seat D, sat a woman who caught nobody's attention at first. She wore a simple navy blazer and kept to herself, occasionally glancing at her watch with an odd intensity. The plane took off smoothly, climbing through scattered clouds as passengers dozed off or buried themselves in books and tablets. About 45 minutes into the flight, something strange happened. The woman in 23D suddenly sat up straight, her face showing visible confusion as she looked around the cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, staring at it with growing distress. A few passengers nearby noticed her becoming increasingly agitated, muttering under her breath and frantically flipping through her carry-on bag. "This isn't right," she said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "This isn't where I'm supposed to be." Her voice carried a mix of panic and certainty that made other passengers exchange worried glances. A kind-faced flight attendant noticed the commotion and approached with a reassuring smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am? Can I get you some water?" What happened next would be retold countless times in news reports and social media posts. The woman stood up, her voice steady, but her eyes wild with conviction. This plane took off from Boston, not Dallas. And it's not 2025. I boarded this flight in 2027. The cabin grew eerily quiet. A businessman 2 rows ahead removed his headphones, wondering if he'd heard correctly. A teenage girl pulled out her phone and started recording, though airline policy prohibited it. "I know how this sounds," the woman continued, her voice growing more desperate. "But something's wrong with reality itself. The temporal displacement readings I detected this morning, they weren't just anomalies. We've crossed through something we don't understand." She pulled out what looked like official documents, her hands shaking as she held them up. Look at the dates. Everything I have is from 2027. My credit cards, my ID, my boarding pass, they're all real, but they're from 2 years in the future." Other passengers craned their necks to see, some frightened, others skeptical, but all completely captivated by the bizarre scene unfolding before them. A young physics student sitting nearby noticed complex equations scribbled in the woman's open notebook, calculations that seemed to deal with quantum mechanics and gravitational fields. The flight attendants exchanged concerned looks, using their training to maintain calm while discreetly signaling for assistance. In the cockpit, the pilot was already discussing the situation with air traffic control, though no one quite knew how to classify this unprecedented disturbance. What made the incident particularly unsettling wasn't just the woman's claims. It was her demeanor. She didn't appear mentally unstable or under the influence. She spoke clearly and logically, even as she described something impossible. Her eyes held a look of genuine fear and confusion, as if she truly believed every word she was saying. As tension in the cabin rose, passengers noticed something else peculiar. Electronic devices in nearby rows began acting strangely. Phones displayed incorrect times, tablets randomly rebooted, and the plane's entertainment systems flickered. A retired engineer sitting in first class would later swear that his watch ran backward for exactly 2.7 seconds. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality, time, and the thin line between possible and impossible. The lead flight attendant had dealt with all sorts of mid-air situations in her 15 years of flying. Medical emergencies, drunk passengers, even a marriage proposal gone wrong. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this. She approached the distraught woman with practiced calm, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. "Let's talk about what's bothering you," she said softly, positioning herself to block the aisle while subtly signaling her colleagues. The woman looked at her with startling clarity, nothing like the usual confusion she'd seen in passengers having anxiety attacks or medical issues. "I understand none of you will believe me," the woman replied, her voice steady despite her apparent distress. "But I can prove it." She reached into her bag, moving slowly to avoid alarming anyone. The flight attendant tensed, but what emerged was just a tablet, its screen displaying what looked like scientific data. Around them, the cabin hummed with nervous energy. A mother quietly redirected her young son's attention to a window game. Two college students whispered theories about parallel universes, their voices carrying further than they realized in the tense atmosphere. "Look at these readings," the woman insisted, pointing to graphs and numbers that meant nothing to most onlookers. "The quantum fluctuations started 3 days ago in my timeline. We thought we were monitoring a minor anomaly, but it was actually a cascade effect." An off-duty pilot sitting nearby leaned forward, curiosity overtaking his initial skepticism. The complex diagrams on display reminded him of advanced aviation physics courses he'd taken years ago, but these seemed to go far beyond anything he'd studied. The woman's tablet suddenly flickered, its screen distorting like a TV with bad reception. "It's happening again," she muttered, frantically tapping at the device. The cabin lights dimmed for a split second, and several passengers gasped as their phones simultaneously lost signal. A second flight attendant arrived with water, using the moment to whisper something to her colleague. They'd already alerted the cockpit, and air marshals were quietly moving into position, though they seemed unsure how to handle this unusual situation. "On my boarding pass," the woman continued, hands trembling slightly as she pulled out more documents, "you'll see the date. April 15, 2027. The paper is real, the watermarks are real, even the digital signature is valid. But it's impossible, isn't it? Because it's 2025 here." The flight attendants exchanged glances. The documents looked authentic, too authentic. One of them had worked for the airline for over a decade, and everything from the paper quality to the holographic security features matched official standards perfectly. More passengers were paying attention now, their initial fear giving way to fascination. A retired physics teacher 3 rows back cleared her throat and spoke up. "Those equations in your notebook," she said, "they look like temporal mechanics theorems, but they're more advanced than anything I've seen published." The woman's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Yes, they're based on Dr. Chen's work from 2026. His breakthrough with quantum tunneling effects." She stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake. "But that hasn't happened yet, has it? Not here." The air grew thicker with tension as flight attendants conferred in whispers. Procedures said they should treat this as a potential security threat, but nothing about the situation fit their training scenarios. The woman wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't demanding anything. She just kept insisting she was from a future that hadn't happened yet. An investment banker in first class, who'd been pretending to sleep through the whole incident, suddenly sat up straight. He'd been checking his stock portfolio when the woman first stood up, and now he noticed something odd. His trading app showed stock prices that made no sense, values that flickered between current rates and numbers that seemed impossibly high. As the crew tried to decide their next move, the woman's agitation grew. Not with anger or violence, but with an increasing urgency that made everyone nervous. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "It's not just about me being in the wrong time. What happened to me? It's just the beginning. There are ripples forming, consequences we never anticipated, and they're getting stronger." The lead flight attendant squeezed her hands together, fighting to maintain her calm expression. In all her years of flying, she'd learned to trust her instincts about passengers. and her instincts were telling her something impossible. This woman was telling the truth. The mood in the aircraft shifted dramatically when two air marshals finally revealed themselves. They moved with careful precision, their training evident in every step. The first marshal, a tall woman with graying hair who'd blended perfectly into the business class crowd until now, took the lead while her younger partner maintained a watchful position near the emergency exit. "Ma'am, we need you to return to your seat," the senior marshal said, her voice firm, but not unkind. She'd handled numerous mid-flight situations before, but something about this one felt different. The woman's documents lay spread across the fold-down tray, each piece more baffling than the last. The younger marshal pulled out his phone to photograph the documents, but his device suddenly shut down. He tried rebooting it, but nothing happened. One by one, electronic devices in the surrounding rows began malfunctioning. The plane's overhead screens flickered and went dark. "It's the temporal distortion field," the woman explained, her voice taking on an almost academic tone despite her obvious distress. "Technology acts unpredictably near the edges of the effect. We documented similar phenomena during the first experiments, but we never thought it could spread this far." The senior marshal picked up one of the IDs. 20 years of experience had taught her every security feature used in official documentation. She ran her fingers over the holographic overlays and security chips. Everything felt right, too right. These weren't forgeries, they were genuine government-issued IDs. But the issue dates were impossible. A young software developer sitting nearby spoke up, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. "Your phone," he said, pointing to the device on the woman's tray table. "That's not just a new model, the whole interface is different. And those apps, I've never seen anything like them." The woman nodded eagerly. "Because they haven't been developed yet. Look at the processor speed, the quantum encryption protocols." She stopped abruptly as her phone's screen began to distort, numbers and letters scrambling themselves before the device shut down completely. The air marshals exchanged concerned glances. Their training covered everything from terrorist threats to drunk passengers, but nothing in the manual explained how to handle someone who appeared to be from the future. The evidence in front of them defied logical explanation, yet here it was. "The temporal displacement is getting worse," the woman warned, pulling out a small device that looked like a heavily modified scientific calculator. "These readings, the interference patterns, are intensifying. We need to land this plane before the field expands further." As if to underscore her point, the cabin lights flickered again. The plane's entertainment systems came back online for a moment, but now they displayed impossible dates and locations. A child pointed excitedly at his armrest screen, showing their flight path passing through what appeared to be 2027. The senior marshal made a decision. She gestured to her partner to contact the cockpit while maintaining her position near the woman. "Tell me more about these temporal effects," she said, buying time while trying to assess the true nature of the threat, if there was one. The woman drew a diagram on her notebook, her hands steady despite the tension around her. "Think of time like a river," she explained. "Usually it flows in one direction, but we discovered ways to create small eddies, tiny swirls in the current. They were supposed to be controlled experiments, contained within our lab's quantum shielding. But something went wrong." Passengers leaned in, their fear giving way to fascination. A high school physics teacher spoke up from a few rows back, asking about quantum entanglement and temporal paradoxes. The woman's answers were complex yet coherent, weaving together accepted scientific principles with theoretical concepts that seemed decades ahead of current understanding. The younger marshal returned from the cockpit, his expression troubled. "The pilots are reporting instrument anomalies. Nothing critical, but their chronometers are desynchronized. Ground control is showing our flight time as both 3 hours ahead and 2 years behind schedule, simultaneously." The woman's face paled. "It's happening faster than before. The field is expanding exponentially." She looked at the senior marshal with pleading eyes. I know this sounds impossible, but if we don't land soon, this aircraft might end up somewhere, or someone, we really don't want to be. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun seemed to flicker, as if someone was quickly turning a light switch on and off. Several passengers swore they could see two different cloud patterns overlapping, like double-exposed photographs. The crisis had moved beyond the simple security situation. It was becoming something that challenged the very nature of reality itself. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady despite the unprecedented situation. Ladies and gentlemen, due to technical difficulties, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Kansas City International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, securing loose items, her practiced smile masking concern, as she noticed the airplane's digital displays showing 3 different times simultaneously. The mysterious woman had grown quieter, focused intently on writing in her journal. Her equations and diagrams flowed across pages with urgent precision, like someone trying to solve a puzzle before time ran out. The retired physics teacher, who'd been watching from nearby, couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. She leaned forward, squinting at the complex formulas. "Those variables," she whispered, "they're describing some kind of quantum field theory, aren't they? But I've never seen these symbols before." The woman looked up, relief flickering across her face at finding someone who partially understood. "It's an extension of current quantum mechanics," she explained, her voice low and intense. "We discovered that consciousness itself creates micro-disruptions in spacetime. Usually, they're too small to matter, but when amplified through certain quantum states." Her voice trailed off as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The overhead bins rattled, and a child started crying somewhere in the back. But this wasn't ordinary turbulence. Passengers watched in amazement as their drinks rippled upward instead of side to side, defying gravity for split seconds at a time. The senior air marshal kept her position nearby, listening intently while pretending to read a magazine. Every instinct from her years of training told her this woman wasn't a threat, at least not in any conventional sense. But the impossible events unfolding around them couldn't be ignored. 10 minutes to landing, the captain announced, his voice slightly less steady now. In the cockpit, the flight crew was dealing with their own strange phenomena. Their instruments showed them approaching Kansas City from 3 different directions at once, even though the plane maintained a straight course. The woman's writing became more frantic. "The temporal displacement is reaching critical levels," she muttered, sketching what looked like wave patterns intersecting with flight trajectories. A young software engineer sitting across the aisle noticed that her pen seemed to leave marks on the paper slightly before she actually wrote them. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights pulsed in an odd rhythm. Personal devices that had died earlier suddenly came back to life, showing notifications from days that hadn't happened yet. A businessman's phone displayed stock prices dated 2 years in the future, while a teenager's tablet showed social media posts that couldn't possibly exist. The woman finally looked up from her journal, her expression a mix of fascination and fear. "Once we land, they'll want to take me into custody," she said to no one in particular. "But they need to understand, I'm not the problem. I'm just the first one to notice what's coming." Through the windows, passengers could see Kansas City approaching, but something was off about the view. Some swore they could see different versions of the city overlapping. One current, one noticeably more futuristic, with buildings that didn't yet exist casting shadows that shouldn't be possible. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk, and the plane began its final approach. The woman closed her journal and handed it to the air marshal. "Make sure this gets to Dr. Chen at MIT," she said urgently. "He won't understand it yet, but in 18 months, when he makes his breakthrough, this will help him prevent the cascade." The plane touched down smoothly despite the bizarre circumstances, but as the wheels made contact with the runway, every electronic device in the cabin synchronized for a brief moment. Hundreds of screens displayed the exact same time, 3:47 p.m., April 15, 2027. Then, just as quickly, they all returned to the present. Emergency vehicles were already waiting on the tarmac, their lights reflecting off the plane's wings as it taxied to a stop. Through the windows, passengers could see not just airport police and fire trucks, but black SUVs with government markings they didn't recognize. The woman sat perfectly still now, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension around her. "They think this is the end of the story," she said quietly to the air marshal. "But it's just the beginning. Time isn't as linear as we thought, and now it's starting to notice us noticing it." The Kansas City International Airport had never seen anything quite like this. As passengers filed off Flight AA 2317, they were met by an unusual mix of authorities. FBI agents in dark suits stood alongside what appeared to be government scientists, their badges unlike anything the airport security had encountered before. The terminal's third floor had been rapidly converted into a makeshift investigation center. Passengers found themselves in a strange limbo, not exactly detained, but not free to leave either. Each person was interviewed separately, their stories creating a puzzle that defied conventional explanation. "Tell me again about the phones," a senior FBI agent asked, his tablet filling with notes as a businessman described how his device has shown stock prices from 2027. The agent had been working federal cases for 20 years, but the growing stack of similar testimonies was making him question everything he thought he knew about reality. In a separate room, a team of quantum physicists pored over the mysterious woman's journal. The equations within it referenced theoretical work that didn't exist yet, building on scientific papers that hadn't been written. One young researcher excitedly pointed out calculations that seemed to solve problems their lab had been struggling with for years. "The temporal inconsistencies are remarkable," the lead scientist muttered, comparing timestamps from various devices collected from the plane. "Look at this. Different phones from the same row showing times varying by 2 years, yet all perfectly synchronized with their respective network carriers." The woman herself sat calmly in an interview room, facing a panel of increasingly frustrated investigators. Their questions ranged from basic identity verification to complex scientific theories, but her answers remained consistent. She spoke of future events with the casual familiarity of someone discussing their past. "We detected the first anomaly during a quantum computing experiment," she explained, sketching diagrams on a provided notepad. Nobody realized what it meant at first. Just some unusual readings, a few microseconds of temporal displacement. But it grew. Down the hall, technical experts struggled with the evidence. The woman's phone, when they managed to power it on, displayed an operating system that didn't exist. Her credit cards were issued by a bank that hadn't been founded yet, but the magnetic strips and security features were flawless. The retired physics teacher from the flight had been kept longer than other passengers, her academic background proving valuable. The mathematics in her work, she explained to investigators, it's like seeing calculus equations in the Middle Ages. The concepts built on things we're only beginning to theorize about. As evening approached, more unusual phenomena began to surface. Security cameras covering the woman's interview room showed strange distortions. In some frames, the room appeared empty. In others, the same conversation seemed to play out multiple times with subtle differences. A young AIDS specialist noticed something odd while reviewing the airport's digital systems. "The timestamps around her location keep shifting," he reported, pointing to his monitor. "And look at this. The security footage shows her in the room, but the thermal sensors don't detect any heat signature." The investigation team's frustration grew as standard procedures proved useless. Fingerprint scans showed no matches in any database, yet when they ran the prints through a newly installed system, it claimed she was already registered, 2 years in the future. Outside the airport, reporters had begun gathering, drawn by rumors of an unusual incident. The official statement about technical difficulties did little to explain the growing number of black government vehicles or the hastily assembled mobile research lab in the parking lot. As night fell, The woman's warnings became more urgent. "You're all focused on proving or disproving my story," she told the lead investigator, "but you're missing the bigger picture. These temporal anomalies aren't just affecting me anymore. They're spreading, growing stronger. Every attempt to measure them only makes them more unstable." In a nearby room, a junior agent watching the interview through a one-way mirror noticed his reflection seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after he did. He quickly wrote it off as fatigue from the long day, not realizing this was just the beginning of much stranger things to come. The mobile forensics lab outside Kansas City International Airport hummed with activity well past midnight. Inside, teams of scientists and analysts worked in shifts, trying to make sense of the most baffling evidence they'd ever encountered. The woman's belongings lay spread across sterile white tables, each item a window into what seemed to be an impossible future. A senior forensic analyst sat hunched over the woman's smartphone, his eyes red from hours of examination. "This isn't just a prototype," he explained to his colleagues. "The components themselves shouldn't exist yet. The processor architecture, the quantum encrypted memory. We're seeing technology that's years ahead of current capabilities." Across the room, another team carefully examined the woman's photos. The images showed familiar cities, but with subtle differences. Buildings that didn't exist, cars with designs no manufacturer had released. Most striking were the news headlines visible in some shots, describing events that hadn't happened yet. "Look at this," a young tech expert called out, pointing to her screen. "The metadata in these files is perfectly intact. They're not manipulated or edited. According to every verification tool we have, these are genuine photos taken by this device 2 years from now." The woman's credit cards posed another puzzle. When run through card readers, they triggered transactions that appeared simultaneously in current banking systems and in database structures that didn't yet exist. A financial crimes expert watched in amazement as the same purchase showed up in 2 different times, the verification codes perfectly valid in both. Meanwhile, in a separate facility, a team of quantum physicists had been analyzing the equations from the woman's journal. These formulas, the lead scientist explained to his government handlers, they're building on theoretical work we're only beginning to understand. But they're not just theories, they're engineering schematics. Someone has figured out how to actually build what we've only dreamed about. The evidence kept mounting. The woman's clothing tags showed manufacturing dates from 2027. But it wasn't just the dates. The materials themselves were different, made with techniques and technologies still in development. Even her wedding ring, a simple gold band at first glance, contained microscopic engravings that couldn't be replicated with current technology. A breakthrough came around 3 a.m. when a junior analyst noticed something in the airport's security footage. "The temporal distortions aren't random," she announced, pointing to patterns in the video glitches. "They're following a mathematical progression. Each anomaly is exactly 2.47 times stronger than the last." The woman's warnings about spreading temporal effects seemed to be proving true. Throughout the night, more reports trickled in from around the airport. Clocks running backward for brief moments. Security cameras showing the same person in 2 places at once. Radio communications picking up fragments of conversations that hadn't happened yet. In the main lab, a physicist demonstrated another disturbing discovery. "Her journal isn't just filled with advanced equations," he explained, showing magnified images of the pages. "The ink itself is changing. Watch." Under the microscope, they could see the written formulas slightly shifting, the variables adjusting themselves as if the mathematics was evolving in real time. The woman's laptop proved equally mysterious. When powered on, it connected to networks that didn't exist, accessing data streams that seemed to flow from different points in time. The operating system showed a copyright date of 2027, but it wasn't just a modified version of existing software. It was something entirely new, built on computing principles that left the best experts scratching their heads. As dawn approached, The team reviewing her medical data made perhaps the most startling discovery. Her DNA analysis shows aging patterns that are temporally impossible, the lead researcher reported. It's as if different parts of her body have literally experienced different amounts of time. Outside the lab, the early morning sun cast strange shadows through the fog. A security guard swore he saw them moving in the wrong direction, just for a moment. In the parking lot, a physicist's car displayed 3 different times on its dashboard clock, all of them technically correct according to the car's internal systems. The evidence was becoming undeniable, yet it offered more questions than answers. Every new discovery seemed to ripple outward, creating its own set of temporal anomalies. The woman's presence had somehow initiated a cascade of events that threatened to unravel the very fabric of time itself. Dawn broke over the Kansas City airport with an eerie calm. The woman had been moved to a secure holding facility late the previous night, a mundane-looking building that hummed with the most advanced monitoring equipment the government could gather on short notice. 2 senior agents stood guard outside her room, their watches occasionally showing impossible times. The morning shift began with a routine check. A guard approached the room, coffee in hand, ready for another long day of watching their unusual prisoner. But when he looked through the observation window, his coffee cup crashed to the floor. The room was empty. The security footage told an impossible story. At exactly 4:27 a.m., the woman simply ceased to exist. One frame showed her sitting calmly on her bed, the next showed an empty room. No flash of light, no dramatic special effects. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. The facility erupted into controlled chaos. Teams of investigators pored over every inch of the room, finding nothing to explain her disappearance. The sensors that had been monitoring temporal anomalies went haywire, their readings making even less sense than before. "Look at this," a technician called out, pointing to his monitor. The temporal distortion readings showed massive spikes at the exact moment she vanished, but they weren't centered on her room. Similar readings appeared simultaneously at locations across the globe. Laboratories, research centers, and universities where quantum physics experiments were being conducted. The investigation team gathered in the main conference room, faces tired from the sleepless night. The lead investigator stood before a wall of screens showing data from the past 24 hours. "We're dealing with something unprecedented," he announced, his voice grave. "This isn't just about one person anymore. Whatever she started, or warned us about, it's spreading." Reports began flooding in from around the world. A physics lab in Switzerland reported their quantum computers synchronizing with data from experiments they hadn't conducted yet. A research facility in Japan documented brief moments where gravity seemed to work backwards. An observatory in Chile recorded stars that appeared to be in the wrong positions, as if viewed from 2 years in the future. Back at the Kansas City airport, passengers from Flight AA 2317 were finally being released. Each had been thoroughly debriefed, their stories cataloged and cross-referenced. As they left, many noticed their phones still displaying occasional glitches, text messages appearing and disappearing, timestamps jumping between years. The retired physics teacher, who had spoken with a woman on the flight, made one final statement before leaving. "She wasn't trying to convince us she was from the future," she explained to investigators. "She was trying to warn us that the future itself had become unstable." In the weeks that followed, strange phenomena continued to surface. Time seemed to flow differently in certain locations, creating what scientists termed temporal bubbles. Inside these zones, people experienced time at slightly different rates, though the effects were only noticeable through precise measurements. The woman's journal became the subject of intense study at top research institutions. The equations within it seemed to predict these temporal anomalies, but more importantly, they hinted at ways to stabilize them. Scientists around the world began collaborating on what would later be called the Temporal Stability Project. 3 months after the incident, a young physicist at MIT made an unexpected breakthrough. While reviewing the woman's notes, he discovered references to his own future work, theoretical papers he hadn't written yet, but now found himself beginning to understand. The boundary between cause and effect had become blurred. The official report on the incident remains classified, filed away in some government archive under a code name. But its effects rippled through the scientific community, sparking new fields of research and challenging our fundamental understanding of time itself. Years later, a security guard at the holding facility would swear that sometimes, late at night, he could see the woman's room through the observation window, exactly as it was that night. For just a few seconds, she would be there, writing in her journal, before fading away again, as if time itself couldn't quite decide where she belonged.